Hey there, Alexandra Horn.
Hi, John Boyd.
Here we are with another episode of Behind the Books from IVP Academic.
This one's a good one. Scot McKnight interviewing Amy Peeler.
Yeah, and it's a fascinating conversation. Amy Peeler is a contributor to the second edition of the Dictionary of Paul and his letters, writing the article on Son of God, and they've got a lot to talk about.
They do. One of the things, John, that I really enjoyed Amy talking about, and I hope we can dig into this a little bit, is Amy and Scot discussing what it is to bring your voice into your writing. And I'd love to hear from you as our editorial director, a little bit of what it means to bring your voice to a reference text, and then let's broaden it just a little bit to what does it look like to bring your voice to academic publishing?
Yeah, a reference book like this, is over 1,000 pages long. There's a lot of people contributing to it. And then there are even 3 volume editors, the scholarly editors, Scot McKnight and Nijay Gupta and Lynn Kohik. They all put their fingerprints on the book. So here's, I think, one way to think about voice for an individual contributor in a big reference project like this is that you're a musician playing in a pretty big orchestra and you need to blend a little bit. But that doesn't mean that there's not an opportunity for,
solo?
The individual. Yeah, exactly. This article that Amy contributed is her chance to step up and have a solo while also blending in. So it's interesting that, that they're talking about that. When it's an individual book, an authored book by an individual scholar, there's a lot more play for that. And my own, opinion about this as a reader as well as an editor is that we want to hear an individual voice. Reading a book by Amy Peeler ought to sound different from reading a book by Scot McKnight, a book by Lynn Kohik, a book by Nijay Gupta. It's one of the jobs, an important job of an editor to make sure that that voice comes through. We're not trying to launder everything, bleach everything out so that it all sounds the same. We're trying to help their voice come through and sound like themselves as clearly as possible.
Yeah, and that's a big part of what this podcast is about, is hearing even beyond the writing, who are they as a person and how does that inform what they're pursuing in their scholarship.
Right. Well, let's get to it.
Enjoy this episode with Amy Peeler and Scot McKnight.
I want to welcome you listeners to this wonderful conversation we're going to have with Dr. Amy Peeler at Wheaton College. Hasn't yet turned to Wheaton University because they have enough identity. They don't have to worry about stuff like that. But she's well known to students, well known to scholars for her work in various areas, including Hebrews. But we are talking about the Dictionary of Paul and his letters, the second edition. And she wrote a wonderful essay or entry on the Son of God. And we will eventually get to a conversation with Amy about that. But I want to welcome you, Amy, to DPL2's podcast.
Excellent. Well, so glad to be here. I think this is an amazing idea to kind of get the life behind this very important book. This is fun.
Well, Amy, I've been a professor for 41 years, so I'm older than most of the people. In fact, I'm older than any of the other editors. But I wonder if you could tell us about how you became a New Testament professor, a scholar of the New Testament, an author in New Testament studies.
Yes. I started college. I went to a Christian liberal arts college, Oklahoma Baptist University. And I think I started as a math major, which now seems really funny. My mom is a high school math teacher, so I think I was following in her footsteps. And then I changed to counseling and psychology. But then as a junior, I took a few electives in New Testament studies. I took Greek. I took a Life of Christ class. And really right away, I think it was in the first week that I said, oh my goodness, this is what I want to do with my life. I was just immediately smitten with the academic, faithful study of the scriptures. I had grown up in the church. I loved reading my Bible. I just did not realize that you could read the Bible in an academic way and really devote your life to its study. And so immediately I said, this is it. This is for me. And so I had very good mentors there, professors and friends in student development who helped me understand what that pathway would look like. And so from college, I went straight to seminary, to Princeton Seminary, and then stayed on there to do my PhD. So I'm one of those very blessed people that my desire for my vocation discovered around the time that I was 20 the doors have opened. God has been faithful to open those doors so that I get to be in a classroom most days of the week and be with other, really interesting, bright undergraduate and graduate students and lead them in this discovery of the riches of God's word.
Who were the professors at Princeton and New Testament when you were there?
Yes. So influential for me, my doctoral advisor is Ross Wagner.
Oh, wow.
And so I'm incredibly grateful both to know him as a scholar and as a believer, and just really grateful for his mentorship. Beverly Gaventa was very shaping for me. I had several courses with her. So the ways that I think theologically about the text, C. Clifton Black taught me Mark and Gospels, George Parsenios, Brian Blunt. I really had a cadre of wonderful professors for those 8 years that I was at Princeton for MDiv and PhD.
Wow. Now, Ross Wagner was a student of mine.
Oh, I love knowing that. That is awesome. What a good pay it forward.
He did his, an MDiv at Trinity.
That's right. Yes.
Then he went on to Duke.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you had great opportunity. I'm a big fan of Brian Blunt.
Oh, he's amazing. Yeah.
I really am. And his book on Revelation is just fantastic. And I'm looking forward to Beverly Gaventa's Romans commentary. I don't know if it's out yet, but I know.
Yes. Not quite. She has that When in Romans kind of beautiful book that kind of tantalizes our anticipation for the full commentary. But
how about writing? Where did you get involved in writing?
Yes. I never thought of myself like as a young person as a writer. In college, we focused a lot on exegesis and translation. I think I was very well trained in the Greek language and had some opportunity to write, but never fancied myself very good at that. I think I learned a lot about writing from Ross in the writing of the dissertation. I think back to his patience with me as a writer. And as I started to work on the volume that is now Women in the Gender of God, which came out last year, some early editing, first with Carrie Newman and then with Trevor Thompson, they were incredibly helpful in helping me to find my voice. I think for a variety of reasons, I didn't have a strong authorial presence, was very diminutive or apologetic, or, well, everybody says this, but I'm not sure what I want to say. I think that's not unusual for young writers. So grew in confidence by their feedback. And now I'm in a place where just by practice, right? When you do it more, you become more confident, hopefully, and more skilled in writing. And that's now something that I greatly enjoy. It's still a struggle and hard. Even this morning, I was working on a second volume to Women in the Gender of God and kind of wrestling with the headache of how does this all fit together? But the crafting of language and argument has become something that is a delight and not just a burden as it was in my early years.
I was given some good advice when I was, 25 years ago by a librarian named Sonia Bodie at North Park University. I was talking to her about writing, and I said, so much of scholarship is boring prose.
Hi.
And by reading boring prose all the time, you sort of become boring in your own prose.
That's right.
And she said, you need to read good essayists. And she introduced me to a Jewish essayist who was in Evanston by the name of Joseph Epstein.
Mm-hmm.
And so I started reading essays, and I have a whole wall of essays now.
Wow.
And I think they really encourage us to put our voice into it.
Mm.
Too much of scholarship is distant. And when you do that, the subject becomes distant.
That's good.
And I'm old enough to remember that when E.P. Sanders wrote Paul and Palestinian Judaism, he used the word I.
Yes.
And people thought it was a little bit forward to be doing that. Well, now it's very common. So, well, that was good. And now, I don't suppose you wrote for any of the other dictionaries. Is that right?
That is correct. No.
How have they figured into your life, your reading, your studying, your teaching, preaching?
Yes, this sounds like, a canned answer to kind of like support the brand, but it is really the truth that my professors used them and recommended that we use them. And so I don't know if you can see there, Scott, but they are there on my shelf. That's where they are. And I've said this to students for years. My go-to when I start a research project, I almost always go to the entry in this dictionary series because I have always found them to be thorough, accessible. You get a good sense of the whole of an idea. It has an excellent bibliography. And so these have been my starting point in research, in writing, maybe a little bit more. That's interesting that you would ask about preaching. I'm a younger preacher than I am a scholar. And so they have been my go-to for scholarship, but I definitely think my scholarship informs then my ecclesial presence. But they're where I start and they're where I direct students. And so when I was first invited to be a contributor, this was an incredible honor. I mean, really, it's that kind of coming of age sense of, wow, something that I've cut my teeth on, I now get to be a contributor. I was quite overwhelmed by the invitation in a very positive way.
Well, that's, it's good news about the dictionary, but they've been that way with me. Now, of course, I was involved in the first one, but from that point on, I did contribute to most of them or to some of them, but I use them all the time because they are comprehensive, accessible, they have evidence, and they have that bibliography, and those bibliographies last quite a while.
Exactly.
How do you think the Dictionary of Paul, I think you've kind of answered this question, this DPL2, how do you think this can help younger students?
Yes. Well, I appreciate that the press saw the need for an updated version. And so just the scope of the entries, the inclusions here speak to, I don't want to just say the moment where we are in scholarship, because I think it's longer than that, but they are attentive to issues that have arisen in ways in prominence that maybe weren't true 25, 30 years ago. A sense for the diversity, the spread, the impact of some of the more active debates, Paul and Judaism, for instance. So there's a freshness to this volume. So I can say this is the most up to date. And it is going to be tone setting for decades to come. It's going to endure that these are the things that you'll need to know about as either a general student of the New Testament, or if you want to specialize in Paul, this is the place to start. So I think it's an excellent leaping off. Like it's introductory for students who maybe are in my New Testament class, who are writing a paper on a topic. I direct them here. But then for my graduate students, this is a good touch point to say, I want to make sure that I'm aware of all these. Now, these bibliography may lead me to other things, and inevitably it will, but it is a good, have I covered my bases here for that more elevated student? It's a place to begin.
Do you use any of them as textbooks?
Oh, that's a great question. I haven't. I've had one textbook that I've used for my New Testament class. I probably will do some changes in the future. But I haven't. Is that something that you've done?
Well, when I used to teach Jesus of Nazareth, 7:45 a.m., Tuesdays and Thursdays, college students, I used to tell my friends, I have 2 minutes to get their attention. After that, they're gone.
Right.
I used it as the textbook at times. Just that was the only text.
That makes sense.
But college students find it's not a book.
Right.
It's not something you read chapter to chapter. It was a little bit too episodic rather than, there was no prose, there's no narrative, there's no story to it. I always have recommended them. And then once I started teaching at Northern, I used it constantly. Every class had one of these dictionaries recommended reading. So
got it. Yeah, that makes sense. My teaching has been for the introductory class, and then I do some specialization in Hebrews or gender. But I can see if I were doing a Life of Christ class or a master's level class, this would be exactly right. But I think for the entry point class for New Testament students, it would be a bit much, maybe.
Just before we got on, a student of mine texted me and said, I want you to know, I'm emphasizing the way she would emphasize, I want you to know that you can download whole books on Zotero.
Whoa.
Now, I don't know if you know what Zotero is.
I am familiar with it. Yes.
That's all I use, Zotero. I've used it for a long time. And my instinct is to say, why do I want any more digital books? I like the book that I can hold in my hands. I can sit in a chair and read it and don't have to have the screen on. Increasingly, our students expect things to be digital. They expect things to be found online. They expect to be able to get things free. If they can't get them free, they'll use Wikipedia and try to cobble things together. Why do you think we need printed books?
Yeah. No, that's an excellent question. I definitely prefer, even feels, when I'm working with a printed book, there's an enjoyment, there's something tangible. I think there's something about embodiment when we can touch a page and read it with our eyes that is different than looking at screens. I would wager that in 10, 15 years, more and more data will come out about how being on screens so often may not be great for the human brain. I mean, I'm seeing this even shift in my children's schools where they were using their Chromebooks all the time, and that's less and less. So I think there's something important in the way that God has designed us to touch what we're working with. And I also think, I know my Greek professor who retired just a few years after I left, so he was kind of definitely of a different era. He would say to us, don't use your BibleWorks program or Accordance or Logos to look up words. Get your big BDAG and look up the word. There's something that your brain learns something better when you're flipping pages. And that's always kind of stuck with me, that when I'm doing exegetical work, I think I get a better sense of what's going on linguistically if I'm looking things up. So I think it speaks to the weight that these volumes carry. Things that are free, we don't put much value on. And yet if they take up some space and if we have to invest in them, then we treat them with more respect. So I'm very glad that IVP, that you all decided we need another print version. This is worth the effort, worth the investment, because I do think it will endure and be treated with more gravity than if we could just all download it.
Yeah, I do. I have to admit, I do download. We have a thing called Digital Theological Library #2. You may have it at Wheaton. I don't know. We have it at Northern, and I download books. It's amazing how many books we can get this way. And I find that I skim them and scan them. I don't read them the same way. I never found Kindle very, very attractive to read.
Yeah, I agree.
It just was, but that could be my age. I like the feel of the book. But there's something, too, about the endurance. This dictionary, by God's grace, is going to be around for 500 years.
That's true. That's true.
I mean, we have books in our libraries that are 1,000 years old. It's going to have an endurance. Of course, it's going to have a life expectancy because eventually the information is going to wear out. But why? What is the value of, let's say, a dictionary entry on Son of God versus the most recent journal article on Son of God?
Yes. Oh, what a fun question. Well, I think students who are researching that particular topic need to be aware of both. But of course, a journal article is going to be very particularly focused on one aspect of that issue, right? It's going to narrow down. It might be that own person's desire to make a particular contribution. It's like the slice of the pie. Whereas a dictionary entry is meant to give you pretty much the whole pie. It's meant to give you that big picture vision, and it's meant to endure more, right? So a journal article, someone then 3 years later may say, oh, well, no, that person didn't get it quite right. And here's what I think is really going on. Or maybe even more likely than that direct disagreement is that it just becomes one of the many things that we can access on something like Atla, which are all very interesting and good, but rarely make a deep impact in the field. Conversely, a dictionary article, as we've already talked about, this is a place where all scholars will come, or many, many scholars will come to begin their work, to get that big picture vision. So I think there are more people who are accessing it, and you get a sense of the whole, not just a little slice. So I think it's really important to have access to these 30,000 foot views of a topic, and then go and read the small pieces as well.
As you were talking this, I was sitting here thinking about, I wrote on Romans, and it's not the same as my little book, Reading Romans Backwards. I had to keep in mind that there are people who have a different viewpoint.
Oh, that's a great point. Yeah.
And so that sense of comprehensiveness and a little bit of a balance, dictionary entries or encyclopedia entries have a responsibility to the discipline.
Yes.
That an individual author doesn't have when he or she is writing a book or an essay. And I think that sense of My responsibility here is to be honest about the state of the question is a part of it.
Yeah. So it's almost less partisan.
Yeah.
Right? It's not just one perspective, but you need to be as big tent as possible to say, here's how a lot of different perspectives could be included in this topic. That's a really important, and what a beautiful thing in the day and age in which we live, that you could get breadth rather than just kind of one side. Yeah.
Well, when we get to Son of God in your entry, way back on page 1005, I think we have a little issue that needs to be resolved for many of our listeners, and that is whether Son of Man means human and Son of God means divine.
Oh, right.
So many people, I noticed Mike Bird wrote about this. I think he mentioned it today on his Substack.
Oh, right.
So say something about that if you can.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's almost maybe counterintuitive to what we as contemporary hearers might immediately think. But Son of Man can be human, right? If we think about the Ezekiel text, where this is a way of talking about humanity, or Psalm 8 is another example. But in a very weighty way, particularly in the Gospels, it seems to me, Son of Man is pointing toward this person who is sent from God to reign. And so it has these aspects of being a heavenly being. So that's from the Daniel literature would be one of the chief places. So that might be a way of pointing toward the sentness from God and the one who will rule over all kingdoms, the power and sovereignty. Conversely, Son of God, I often show my students a little interaction from the comedian Stephen Colbert and the New Testament writer Bart Ehrman, and they have kind of a funny exchange over a number of things. But Stephen Colbert ends up saying, well, what's the son of a duck? A duck. What's the son of God? Must be God. Kind of this cheeky way of pointing to how we might think of the phrase. But as I cover here, and something that was really helpful in my own research, is to realize that in Israel's scriptures, Son of God, when given to a particular person, was given to the king or the hoped for heir of the king. This was a way of showing respect, showing that proximity, that representative of that person between the nation and God, but was not conceived of as a divine title. Israel did not divinize their kings in the way that maybe some other nations around them did. And so it was not immediately in the ears of Jewish hearers, oh, this person is divine. It was more a sense of, oh, this person is royal, or this one is the one that will reign. So it's almost the opposite of what we might say. Does that align with how you see it, Scott?
Yes. In fact, I was thinking of Daniel Boyarin, who wrote a very little book on, I think it was just on Son of Man, maybe it was a book on Jesus, in which he sort of cheekily just made the point that Son of Man is divinity and Son of God is humanity. And he flipped.
Yeah,
Of course, he knows the
Simple.
conversation. But I remember being taught this when I was a Sunday schooler as a kid and in college. I don't think I heard it in seminary, but that's completely flipped. And I agree with you. Well, how was Son of God understood in the Greco-Roman world?
Yeah, and that was a lot of fun discovery for me. And so I trace here like a few different levels of, you could think about kind of the pantheon of the gods, who are kind of just like bad behaving humans who are having relationships with one another, or sometimes the gods having relationship with women, so that you get both the gods and then these demigods. And so there's that aspect of the kind of mythology that is at play. There's also very much the political statement that Son of God is a way of referring to the emperor, because the previous emperor had been divinized upon death, and so therefore Caesar is Son of God. Michael Peppard's work was very helpful for me to see the political implications of this title. And so the people who are coming out of a Greek, Roman, Hellenized, Latinized background have kind of some categories that they're bringing to this phrase. And then the people from a Jewish context, not that those are two they're sealed off from one another, but are thinking about the scriptures of Israel and this divine, not divine, but this royal title. And so they're bringing kind of different packages to the concept of this phrase. I think what the authors of the New Testament do with it, what Paul does with it, is to say, yeah, I know this is where you're starting, but let me enhance this picture of who the Son of God is by virtue of what has been revealed to us in the person Jesus Christ, which is so often how so much of New Testament work, starting where people are and getting them to expand their vision based on what God has done in Christ.
Let's back up and clarify a little bit more for our listeners what Son of God would have meant in Jewish literature.
Sure.
I think we can get the big scan, but I think a little bit more detail about the Jewish can help. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you do have places in which God speaks collectively of the people of Israel as God's son, the redemption out of Egypt. You have this note in Hosea. I mean, it's not often, but it is present that God sets himself as the father of the nations, but that's like a collective sense. And there's great care exercised that it's not some kind of procreative, right? That God has sired people. No, it's a way of speaking of this image of care and protection, discipline at times. If you think about the wisdom literature, that God will discipline his children, but then it becomes specified only in the person of the king. The only individual in Israel who is called the Son of God is the king. And you have this in some of the Psalms that are well known, Psalm 2, Psalm 89, that this person, as the representative of the nation, as the king, is bestowed this honorific of being like the Son of God, the one who is so proximate to God that that person can then exercise care for the nation. Is that what you're getting to? So it's both this corporate and specific sense.
You're the one who wrote the essay. I think like Psalm 2, this day I have begotten my son, or however it's translated, where it has that royal sense. Now, my professor, now this starts to get us into the New Testament. My professor was James D.G. Dunn. He became sort of famous. I mean, he wrote a book on baptism in the Spirit that did very well, influential. But then he wrote a book, Unity and Diversity, and it just was very controversial at the time. He wrote a book called Jesus in the Spirit that was pretty influential for me in understanding, and that Son of God, in some sense, is Jesus's experience of God as Father.
Yes. Oh, that's good. Yeah.
Have you explored that at all?
Yes. I think that is fitting to what we get of the Gospels. Of course, the prayer that Jesus gives, Abba, Father, there's all of that discussion of how that wasn't unheard of in Jewish literature, but the way in which Jesus did it, the frequency that Jesus uses this paternal language for God is distinct and noticeable. And he does have this sense throughout the Gospels, but maybe prominently placed in John, of this intimate relationship of care and support with God. And so I very much think that is his experiential sense by the power of the Spirit, remaining in communion with the Father, even in his incarnate state, that then by the power of the Spirit is given to us. And this moves us maybe into Galatians and Paul, where this spirit of adoption, so that we too can cry out to God as our Abba, our Father. So it's Jesus's experience can become our own when we become participants in Christ.
Yeah, Jimmy's emphasis was the charismatic experience of God by Jesus, because he was tied into the discussion in England and Scotland at the time, into the charismatic movement. It had just started invading there. And so he did his dissertation on that, and then he did Jesus in the Spirit. I think we make a mistake in studying Paul or anybody in the New Testament when we think that it's just theology. It's just theoretical discussion of a title. And I remember sitting and listening to Jimmy and saying, this was Jesus's experience of God, that we need to recognize that he called God Father because he experienced God as Father. And then when I was doing Jesus studies in the Jesus seminar at SBL, a guy named John Miller wrote a book in which I don't know if you've ever heard of this one. It didn't do a whole lot, but I sat in the seminars and listened to him a couple of times, that because Jesus lost his father,
oh yes,
he saw God as Father.
Mm-hmm.
And it just intensified what I had learned from Jimmy Dunn. So let's turn to Paul now. And I'd like you to outline how you sort of discuss Son of God in the Pauline literature, because I think you do this so well. It's critical for Paul's theology. It's connected to Jesus in his death and resurrection, and the Son of God and the family of God, which is a translation of sons of God, which is how Paul uses the expression. So maybe a little bit about each one of those.
Yes, yes. I think there's I love trying to recover how radical Paul's conversion was, his experience of the resurrected Son. Encountering him, he was a person of deep faith and deep study, and then had this encounter, and I believe had to reassess all that he learned, and had very mystical spiritual experiences with God, and was taught this way of reading. And so his concept of God, and this is where I start, his concept of God is not a general one. And that would be true because he's Jewish, right? He knows who God is by virtue of revelation from Israel's scriptures, chiefly. And yet, as he encounters Jesus, who he comes to believe is the Son of God, is worthy of the divine name, then his concept of God becomes defined. God is not generally God. God is not even just the God of Israel. God becomes the Father of Jesus Christ. And I should say becomes in Paul's conception, right? And Paul would say, well, this has always been true from eternity past, but I only have now realized it. And so that becomes God's name. God is the Father of Jesus Christ and the Father who raised him from the dead. That God as creator has the power of life, and that is manifest in this powerful way that God has defeated death by raising the Son. And that becomes defined. So there are some very tricky places where some might be led to believe Jesus is Son of God only at the resurrection, some kind of adoptionist reading. But I don't think that's the most fitting way to read Paul. Instead, the son-father relationship, I believe Paul gives us as an eternal one. Philippians 2, I think, is a great place to see that demonstrated. But then this defeat of death is the revelation of God's power on the earthly plane. And so associating God's fatherhood with resurrection is a frequent theme in Paul, and it's an important one to address. And then finally, how do we get incorporated into this? And this is really where maybe I've spent the majority of my work, is that we too don't kind of conceive fatherhood any way that we want based on our own experience or culture. But instead, we know God as Father chiefly because God is the Father of Jesus Christ. It's a very specifically defined identity that then we are caught up into this family only through the Son. And therefore, it is the Son and the Son's revelation that defines how we should think about God as Father. So I've kind of packaged all three together there. Maybe you want to go into some depth on one of them.
Yeah. You know, the Paul's most popular term for the church is siblings.
Right, exactly.
It's not the word church, and it's not the word kingdom, which he should have used because Jesus did, but he didn't. So we'll forgive him for that. But it is fascinating to me how family shape Pauline understanding of, let's say, the church is, and how our primary relationship with other believers is as siblings. Brothers and sisters is how the NIV translates. It's the simple Greek word is adelphoi, is brothers,
right?
But it's clear that it's inclusive. So they translated brothers and sisters. But I translated in the Second Testament as siblings only because I wanted to use one word just like the New Testament uses one word. And it's a unifying word rather than a distinguishing word. But, okay, I'm not trying to be the only one who says this. And I want at times just to be different for the sake of creating a different impression on people. But it is fascinating to me how familial Pauline ecclesiology is when you say that Jesus is the Son of God, God is the Father, we are the children of God, we are the family of God, we are sons of God, and all of a sudden it becomes a relationship of God as Father to children. And we become children. And this seems to be a major framing category for Paul, is that God generates this family.
Yes.
So, I mean, you developed this very well.
Well, and I think it's something that I really enjoy emphasizing with my students, that those of us who are blessed to grow up in the church and Christian homes have become so acclimated to this language. Oh, we're all brothers and sisters. And I'm glad that that's comfortable and familial to us, and familiar both. But I really want them to capture, this is not simple. This is really profound, what Paul is saying. The God of the universe, creator of all, sovereign of all, cares for you as a father. And that is demonstrated, that is proven in the life, death, and resurrection and ascension of Jesus Christ. That's a big deal. And then for Paul, that has so much impact in how he's bringing these communities to unity, right? That you don't think of each other as your different class or your different status. You think about one another as you would a brother or sister. And that has real implications, very practical implications for how you live together. And if we've forgotten that or become comfortable with that language, we need to find a way to be renewed to the sense of the power of what's being said about what family we belong to.
Amy, I was just in the South. I won't mention the state, but I was struck by the number of people who called me Dr. McKnight. Our students don't call us doctors, not very often. Every now and then, some of them do, but it stands out as different because it's so different. And I remember when I first got my doctorate, students said, "What do we call you?" And I said, "My parents named me Scott, and I prefer that name." And some students, of course, were uncomfortable with that. But I think that sibling relationship, and I was a professor, I was a Matthew specialist at the time. I still like to think of myself that way. But Jesus says in Matthew 23, you're not, you're all brothers and sisters.
Right.
And so I have emphasized this. And I think as a professor, having students address me with respect by my first name, rather than it's not just casual thing. For me, it has always been a sacrament of our ecclesiology.
Wow.
To be treated as a brother rather than as a doctor.
Yes. That's
I mean, no one calls me professor anymore. But
No, that's something radical, I think, in Paul's ecclesiology, is that there really is no space for fathers. Like, there is the sibling relationship. Now, that doesn't mean to say that isn't leaders, and sometimes the buck stops with someone, but not this sense of kind of innate hierarchy, it seems to me, right? There's the only person who is father is God, and the rest of us serve one another.
Paul can slip at times into saying he's a mother. Beverly Gaventa
Yes.
has a wonderful book on this.
Right.
And he can say, he's father, but it's clearly not the way he wants to talk about himself.
Right.
And I think that's so important. Now, okay, we all want to hear what Amy Peeler is working on now and working on next. What are you going to be writing? I loved your book on the gender. I don't know the title of it right now.
Yeah. Women and the Gender of God.
Gender of God. Yeah. I loved that book, and I read it slowly and blogged about it or whatever. So what's next on the agenda for you?
Sure. So I do have a commentary on Hebrews coming out in late May. I wrote for the Commentaries in Christian Formation series. Tom Wright has the Galatians volume. And so mine will be the second New Testament volume to come out. That's May 21st. So kind of half of my scholarly life has always been on Hebrews, and the other half has been on these familial themes, gender themes. But then, as I mentioned, the major project that I hope to finish this calendar year is the second volume, to Women and the Gender of God. That volume focuses dominantly on the Gospels and the story of Mary preserved therein. But there are, of course, lots of interesting gender questions in Paul. So this is the kind of conceit of this book is, to what degree is Paul aware of the incarnation, that Christ was born of a woman? And we know he is, Galatians 4:4. And what difference does that knowledge make in these passages that have proved challenging in Pauline interpretation? So 1 Corinthians 11, 1 Timothy 2. It's a bit terrifying to write a book on Paul because so much already good has been said. But my conviction is that the struggles with this idea of men and women finding their place in the church is a big enough problem that there can be many of us contributing perspectives. And so I see my contribution as one more perspective to an ongoing conversation. Honestly, when I turned in Women in the Gender of God, it had 4 or 5 chapters on the Pauline material. But Trevor Thompson and I decided trying to do too much in one place, we'll cut all that and do a second volume.
Very good.
So I'm very, very excited. And it is fun to work on it every day. Yes.
So your experience with writing a book like this is sufficient to know that you think pretty good chance you'll have it submitted by the end of the year.
That's my hope. I'll be on sabbatical in the fall. And so my hope is, given the work I've already done, that I can have a good manuscript by the end of December. That's the hope.
Well, very good, Amy. It's been wonderful talking with you about the Dictionary of Paul and his letters and your entry on the Son of God. And, we wish blessings on all your work as you continue forward. Thank you very much.
Well, same to you, Scott. So good to talk and discuss and continue learning from you. So thank you for all that you've done to serve.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of Behind the Books from IVP Academic.
Join us next week when Nijay Gupta chats with contributor Luis Gosbell.
Behind the Books is a production of IVP Academic. For more information on any IVP titles mentioned in this episode, visit ivpress.com and use code IVPOD25. That's IVPOD25 for 25% off. Sound engineering by Honest Podcasts. Our producers are Alexandra Horn and Travis Alberton. Our production assistants are Christine Policcio-Mello and Jack Reese. Our hosts are Scot McKnight, Lynn Kohik, Nijay Gupta, John Boyd, and Alexandra Horn. Don't forget to subscribe to our show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts, and leave a rating and review to support the show.